So in today's video, we're going to look at the if function in Google Sheets. And so let's go ahead and click in and type equals if, and then a left opening parentheses. And then let's click on this formula help. And so you can see we have three parameters that go into an if function. First is a logical expression. And so what this means is we're basically asking a question that you can answer yes or no to, or in spreadsheet vernacular, true or false. And so in their example, is the contents of cell A2 foo? And if so, if it's true, we're going to return this string. Otherwise, we're going to return this string. And so let's put it in the context of our data here. So let's look at our rep column. So B5, is that equal to Stanley? And if so, we'll put Stanley as our text. Otherwise, not Stanley. And then hit enter. And then we can either double click here or we can drag it down. So either one works. Let's double click right now. And you can see every time the rep is Stanley, it's returning Stanley. And so this doesn't have to be text. We could do something like Stanley, and then we could return the number from here. And then we could drag that down. And you can see every time it's Stanley, now it says Stanley. And then every time it's not Stanley, it's returning the number. So you don't have to do the same thing for both true and false. You can do basically whatever you want here. So another thing you could do is you could nest this if statement. And so this gets a little more complicated, but I'm going to show you some ways to simplify this here in a moment. Let's take a look at this for a moment. So what if not only do we want to see if it's Stanley or not, but we want to see if the amount is over 25,000. So let's go ahead and check that. If C5 is over 25,000, and then let's just say that's a big sale. But right now we're in Stanley. So is it Stanley? True. So maybe we'll say Stanley, and then we'll put dollar, dollar, dollar. Otherwise, Stanley, dollar. And then we're going to close that with a right parentheses. And so now if we hit comma and we pull this open again, you can see we're in value if false. So it kind of highlights wherever you are in the if statement. And so as we look at this, here's our complete if statement inside of the true part for is this Stanley. And so if it's not Stanley, we want to do something else here. So we could just say not Stanley and then close this out. And then we could drag this down. And you can see here, so now the Stanleys are still showing up as Stanleys. And then if it's under 25,000, we see $1 sign, just like that. And this one's over 25, so there we see 3. And as we look down, we again see the same thing. But what happens if we want to see this dollar sign for both Stanley or not Stanley? And so in that case, we need to nest another one here. And so here, we're going to do again, if C5 is over 25,000, we'll do not Stanley, and then $3 signs, or not Stanley, dollar sign. And then we need 2 parentheses at the end. The reason why is because we have one overarching if statement, or the wrapping one outside, and then we have 2 of them inside. So here's one, and then here's the other. So the reason why we have 2 parentheses at the end is the first one is closing this if statement. The second one is closing this one. And so a common error that happens with this, just typos usually, is we're maybe missing a closing parentheses. And so if we hit enter, we'll get this error. So wrong number of arguments. Expected between 2 and 3, but got 4. And so what that means is you're missing a parentheses somewhere. And so you can just look through each if statement and say, did I close that? And so if we close that, now we can see this last one turn red. And that's because we have too many now. So if we remove that, enter, and now we can drag this down. And now you can see we have Stanley and not Stanley, and then our big or little money. And so that's how you do a simple nesting. Now, if we look at the whole picture of this sheet and the different conditions we have quite a few. And so we could put this all in an if statement, but it's going to get pretty confusing. So for example, we have one condition that if it's less than 0%, there's no commission. And so one thing as you try to put something like this together is look at is there anything overall that's going to disqualify? And so, for example, here, commission. So if there's no commission, and if, for example, these are disqualified for that amount, if it's under 0%, then we would want to start with that. And so let's open this up. If this is less than 0, then we'll just return 0. And then we could do the rest of our statements. And so that's a quick way to narrow the things down. And then maybe we had something else where we want a default. So let's say if the total amount is less than 10,000. So we have a couple here. So in that case, we would want to do or to combine this. And so we could say if C5 is less than 10,000 or D5 is less than 0. And so we have two different things we can use here. One is an or, and that's saying, is this or that true? Or we could do both, and that's with a and. So and means both have to be true. So in this case, if the margin is less than 0 and the amount is less than 10,000, and let's look at our, so there's our, go ahead and do that real quick. And then otherwise we'll say eligible. And so let's drag this down. So you can see there's 0%. And so that's because it's negative and less than 10,000, right? Because it's and. Now, if we change this to 12,400, you can see now it's eligible. The reason why is because this is true, but this one is false. And so with the and, both have to be true. And so because they're not both true, then we skip past the true and go to the false. And so in this case, if we want to disqualify this one, we'd have to do or. And so this would be if it's less than 0% or it's less than 10,000. And so let's see, we got and for these. Let's go ahead and drag this up and drag it down real quick. So here you can see now, even though this is over 0%, it's under 10,000. And so that results in 0. All right. So let's go ahead and go back up to the top here. And let's look at building a little bit of this logic. So we're going to do if D5 is less than 0, we're going to put 0 for our commission. So we're going to start that with our base. Now, the next part is if we look at this commission, we have this whole range where we have to go look at, is it between 0 and 14.99, 15% to 19.99. And so instead of building it in here, a much better way to do this is to use a VLOOKUP. And so let me show you how to structure this. So if you have something like this where you have a range, then what we're going to do is build a little table. So I'm going to copy that over. And then let's do this. And so what we're going to do is we're going to split this. So let's put 1499. Let me add some decimal places here. And then this will be 1999, 2999. And then let's get rid of the rest of that and turn these into numbers there. So we can leave this one blank. Now, one thing to keep in mind is you don't have to have this column. But let me show you how this works. So let's just calculate the commission percentage for each of these. So the way we would look it up is using VLOOKUP. And so I can grab this margin percentage, and then I can look up in this table. And so with this table, I want to hit F4 so it doesn't move as I drag down. And then if you don't have F4 on your keyboard, just add a $sign before the column references and before the row references. Then I can hit comma, and then the index here. So VLOOKUP is search key, which was our margin, our range where we're looking, which is this range. Index is the column I want to return. So here's number 1, number 2, and I want to return the commission. So that's 3. And then finally, is it sorted? And this is sorted, and it needs to be sorted. So we're going to do true. So just keep that in mind as well, that you need to start with the smallest and then go up from there. And so this returns 5%. So let's drag this down and see what we come up with. So here we have 5%. So that's our over 30. So let's go down to, here's a 13. So that should be 1%. And then here's a 27%, which is 4, and that's correct. And then here's a 14. So that should be 1%. And there we go. And here's a error. And why is that? Because minus 1% is less than 0, so it did not find that. Now, if we go back here, if we add our if statement and say if D5 is less than 0, 0, and then we do our VLOOKUP, and now we can drag this down again, you can see now we're covered. And so if you need to cover it otherwise, we could wrap this with a if error. And then let's get rid of that if statement real quick. And then if we drag this up and down, you can see now change it to decimal. So let's change it back to percentage if you're not wondering what's happening there. And let's get rid of those decimal places there. So now it's showing nothing, because what this if error does, if we tap in here, so if this doesn't have an error, it's going to return it. Otherwise, it's doing nothing. And so let's just do something like this, error. And so there you can see error. And so because this VLOOKUP can't find it, it's returning this. So this is where we could put that 0 instead. And if we drag this down and drag it back up, so that's another way we could compensate for that. But let's go ahead and go back up here. So one thing, as we look at all these different functions, another way you can simplify things. So we could put now a if statement and be D5 is less than 0. And then we could look up our margin in this table. So we have simplified a little bit, right? And then now how do we incorporate these things? So one way you can simplify, instead of doing if, in this case we could do or, this equals true or that equals true. Now one thing that's interesting when you have these check marks is you don't actually have to do equals true. You could just do E5 or F5. That's just a little trick there. So if either of those true, then we could do 1%, otherwise 0%. Now, how do we incorporate this into our VLOOKUP? So we could do plus. Now we have this false thing here because if this is less than 0, we need to do 0, and then now we have this together. And so let's go ahead and close out our if statement and drag this down, and let's see how our conditions are working now. So this 31% should be 5, and there it is, and it's not adding anything. This one should also be 5, but we have one of these is checked, and so it's 6%. So let's just test this out. So if we hit renew, 6%, do both, still 6%. If we do just upsell, 6%. Okay, that seems to be working. So here's a 13%. So that one should be 1, but we have renew checked. And so if we uncheck it, we can see that's working there as well. So this is a great way if you need to combine several different things. So instead of doing this long, complicated if statement, where we're nesting multiple things, we can do this plus, and we can add multiple things together. Now, if you look, here I have a percentage. And so if I'm trying to come up with a dollar amount, you may be wondering, well, I already did this VLOOKUP, and I did it times the amount. And now if I do this dollar amount, and it's not coming up with the right amount, and the reason why is because this is multiplying first. And so if you're going to do this, what you'll want to do is do all the percentages first, or do all the combinations first. And what you want to do is use parentheses. And this comes back to that age-old Facebook or social media thing where they ask that math question, right? And it has parentheses, and it's like, what is the answer to this? So the way it works in Google Sheets is if you wrap something inside parentheses, it's going to do that first. And so if we do all of our combo here to calculate our commission percentage, and then we wrap that inside parentheses, we can do times with that asterisk, the amount, and then it's going to calculate correctly. So here you can see we come up with a different amount. Remove these parentheses, it's coming up with a smaller amount. The reason why is because when we wrap this with parentheses, it's adding those percentages together before it times it by that amount. And so there we go. Now we have that. So that compensates for our margin lookup here. And now we're including our renew and upsell. Now, one more thing is we have a bonus. So they get +1 commission if their monthly sales is over 100,000. And so the way I'm calculating this is I have each rep listed here, and then I have a sum ifs, which is looking at column C, which is amount, where column B is equal to I5, which is that Dwight right there. And so if I look over here, Dwight has over 100,000. So he should be getting +1%. So what we can do here is inside of our parentheses here. Now, one thing that will make this easier is, and let's go up to the formula bar to do this. If you hit Control Enter, or I think it's Command Enter on Macs, you can actually make a new line in your formula. And this can help, especially if you're doing a complicated one. That way you can kind of put it together and visually kind of see what you're doing. So for example, here we have our parentheses that is wrapping our percentage calculation. And so maybe we could do something like this. We could pull this up, we could drop this down, and then we could drop this down, and then we can just do our calculations in here. And it's a little easier to visualize. And so maybe we'd even drop this down, and then we're going to put each one on a new row. So we hit enter, that's still working great, and there we go. And so at this point, now we need to do a lookup to see if this rep, so Stanley, does Stanley have more than 100,000? Well, no, he doesn't. But how do we put that in this formula? So what we can do here, I'm going to do Control Enter again. If, and now I have to do some kind of combo, right? So how do I match this? So there's a couple different options here, and I think I'll just use VLOOKUP, I think. And then we can look at that rep, and then we can come over here and select these cells and make sure to hit F4 to lock those again so it works as we drag them down. And then here I just need to go to the second column, so it's column 1 and column 2. And this time, so before we did true, you can see here we have true. That's because it was sorted, right? 0, 15, 20, and 30. Now we're doing text. So in text, we're going to do false. And so there's our answer. So if we hover over this, there we see 98,900, which is indeed Stanley's total. So at this point, we're going to say, is that over 100,000? So if that's over 100,000, we're going to do our 1%. Otherwise, we can do 0%. And then we can close that. And now, if we close this out, okay. And so if we click back in here, what I missed here was a plus. So if we're doing this, we need to make sure we add a plus or some kind of mathematical thing to tie these together. So now if I hit enter, there's our commission percentage. So let's go ahead and drag this down. And there is our total. So let's actually go back to that commission percentage before we add. And so we'll drag this down, and then let's change it back to percentage just so we can take a look. So let's run through the logic real quick here. So this one, 39% margin. So that means 5%. And then one of these is checked. So it's 6%. And it's Stanley does not have an extra 1%. So that's correct. So let's look at Dwight. Dwight's the only one with that 1%. So let's look at a sample for Dwight. So Dwight, 13%. So that's a 1%. We have one of these checked. That's another 1%. And he has over 100,000. That's a third 1%. So that comes up with 3. So let's do 35% here. And now we have 7. So let's just double check that. So there's 5%, 6%, 7%. All right. So that's coming up with it all together. So let's go ahead and finish this out now. Times our amount. And then let's drag this down. It looks funky because it's in percentage format. So let's change it to currency. And we'll drag that back up there. And so there we have our commissions at last. And so let's go ahead and summarize our commissions real quick. So we'll use a sum ifs, and let's add that commissions where the rep is equal to the rep listed here. And then we can let that autofill. And so there we go. There's our final commissions for our reps. All right, so that's it for today's video. Make sure to check out the other videos on our channel for more tutorials on both Google Sheets and AppScript. And as always, have a great day.